I stood in my childhood bedroom staring at the empty velvet jewelry box where my engagement ring should have been. The ring Marcus designed for me before his sudden death 6 months ago. $590,000 worth of flawless diamonds arranged in his grandmother's vintage setting, crafted with his own hands during his final weeks of life. My parents had sold it to fund my sister, Brooklyn's spiritual healing retreat in Bali. They never asked. They never even told me until I discovered the theft myself. Instead of screaming or breaking down like they probably expected, I made a different choice entirely. I would disappear from their lives, but not in the way they hoped. The autumn leaves crunched under my tires as I pulled into the circular driveway of my parents' sprawling Connecticut estate. I had driven up from Boston expecting a quiet family dinner, maybe some leftover tension about Brooklyn's latest drama, but nothing more serious than our usual dysfunction. The house looked the same as always, all red brick and white columns like something from a magazine about successful suburban families. I grabbed my overnight bag from the back seat of my Honda and walked up the familiar stone pathway. Through the front windows, I could see movement in the living room and hear voices carrying from inside. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door, I was greeted by chaos. Designer suitcases covered every surface of the marble-floored entryway. Louis Vuitton luggage sets, expensive travel accessories, and what looked like enough clothing for a year-long vacation were scattered across the Persian rugs. Brooklyn stood in the center of it all, her honey blonde hair swept into a perfect messy bun, wearing yoga pants that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Susie," she squealed when she saw me rushing over with arms outstretched. "Perfect timing. I was hoping you'd get here before I finished packing." I hugged her back automatically, but something felt off. Brooklyn had been talking about needing a break after her divorce for months, but this looked like preparation for permanent relocation rather than a vacation. "Where exactly are you going?" I asked, setting my bag down carefully between a set of matching cosmetics cases. "Bali, can you believe it? 3 whole months at this incredible wellness retreat center. I'll be doing yoga, meditation, sound healing, all kinds of amazing spiritual work. Mom and Dad surprised me with the whole package as an early Christmas gift." My stomach dropped. I knew our parents had money, but a 3-month luxury retreat in Bali would cost tens of thousands of dollars. Brooklyn had been working part-time at a boutique clothing store since her divorce supposedly left her financially struggling. There was no way she could afford this herself. "That's really generous of them," I managed, trying to keep my voice neutral. Brooklyn beamed, completely missing my discomfort. "I know, right? They said I deserved to heal properly after everything Kyle put me through. Mom found this place that specializes in helping women recover from toxic relationships. It's supposed to be life-changing." She continued chattering about meditation schedules and organic meal plans while I nodded politely, but my mind was elsewhere. I had come here tonight specifically to pick up my engagement ring. I wanted to have it resized so I could wear it on a chain around my neck, closer to my heart. Marcus had spent weeks designing every detail before his brain aneurysm took him from me without warning. "I should go put my things upstairs," I interrupted gently. Brooklyn waved me off, already turning back to her suitcases. "Go ahead. Mom and Dad are in the kitchen arguing about whether I packed enough sunscreen." I climbed the curved staircase to the second floor, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet runner. My childhood bedroom had been preserved exactly as I left it for college, complete with the antique jewelry box on the vanity where I'd been keeping Marcus's ring for safekeeping. The moment I lifted the lid, my world tilted sideways. The ring was gone. I stared at the empty compartment where the platinum and diamond masterpiece should have been resting in its custom foam padding. Marcus had created something extraordinary for me, incorporating stones from his grandmother's 1945 wedding set with modern diamonds he'd selected personally. The center stone alone was 4 carats of flawless clarity, surrounded by smaller diamonds, arranged in an intricate floral pattern that caught light from every angle. My hands shook as I searched through every compartment of the jewelry box, hoping maybe I'd moved it somewhere else during my grief fog, but I knew I hadn't. The ring had been here 2 weeks ago when I visited for Eleanor's birthday dinner. I sat down heavily on my old bed, trying to process what this meant. My parents wouldn't have moved it without asking. They knew how precious it was to me, how it represented not just Marcus's love, but his final creative act before death stole him away. Unless... The sound of Brooklyn's laughter drifted up from downstairs, mixing with the murmur of our parents' voices. Suddenly, her expensive luggage and 3-month luxury vacation made terrible sense. I walked downstairs on unsteady legs, finding my family gathered in the kitchen around the granite island where Eleanor was packing what looked like a pharmacy's worth of supplements and medications into Brooklyn's carry-on bag. "Brooklyn," I said, my voice surprisingly calm, "did Mom and Dad happen to mention how they're paying for your retreat?" She looked up from organizing her passport and travel documents, her green eyes bright with excitement. "Oh, they got creative. You know how Dad's always saying we should make our assets work for us? They helped me out by selling some old jewelry that was just sitting around collecting dust." The room went completely silent. Richard stopped sorting through travel insurance paperwork, and Eleanor froze with a bottle of probiotics halfway into the bag. "What jewelry?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Eleanor cleared her throat nervously. "Sweetheart, we should have discussed this with you first, but that engagement ring was just sitting in your old room and Brooklyn needed help with her healing journey. We thought it would be better to put those diamonds to good use instead of having them remind you of sad memories." The world seemed to slow down around me. My mother had just admitted to selling Marcus's ring to fund my sister's vacation. "How much did you get for it?" The question came out in a whisper. Richard straightened his shoulders, probably thinking his business voice would make this sound more reasonable. The estate dealer appraised it at $590,000. Quite a bit more than we expected, actually. Marcus certainly spared no expense. $590,000. They had stolen nearly $600,000 from me without asking, without even telling me, until I discovered it myself. "We can give you a portion of the money," Eleanor added quickly, misreading my shock as greed. "Once Brooklyn gets back and settled, we can work out something fair for everyone." Brooklyn nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. I mean, I already paid for the retreat and flights and everything, but there's still money left. We can figure it out when I'm feeling more centered and ready to handle practical stuff." I looked at each of their faces, searching for any sign that they understood the magnitude of what they had done. Eleanor appeared anxious but defensive, like she was preparing to justify a difficult parenting decision. Richard wore his typical problem-solving expression, as if this was just another financial transaction to be optimized. Brooklyn seemed genuinely confused about why I wasn't celebrating her good fortune. None of them understood. They had sold the last physical connection to the love of my life to pay for a luxury vacation, and they thought they were doing me a favor. "I need some air," I said, walking toward the back door before anyone could respond. I stood on the flagstone patio, staring out at Eleanor's carefully maintained garden, while my brain tried to process this betrayal. The ring wasn't just expensive jewelry to me. It was Marcus's final love letter, his last creative work, his grandmother's legacy combined with his vision for our future together. And they had sold it like it was a stock they needed to liquidate. When I finally went back inside, Brooklyn was sealing the last of her luggage while Eleanor fretted over whether she'd packed enough formal wear for special dinners at the retreat center. "Feel better?" Eleanor asked, her tone hopeful. "Much," I lied, forcing a smile onto my face. "I think I understand now." The relief that washed over all 3 of their faces told me everything I needed to know about their expectations. They had assumed I would be upset initially, but come around once I realized they were helping Brooklyn heal from her traumatic divorce. What they didn't realize was that I understood something else entirely now. I understood that my family was willing to steal from me to enable Brooklyn's whims. I understood that they valued her emotional comfort over my deepest grief. And I understood that they had no intention of treating me as an equal member of this family ever again. But I also understood something they didn't expect. I understood exactly how I was going to respond to this betrayal, and it wasn't going to involve forgiveness or family reconciliation. It was going to involve justice. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bed feeling strangely calm. While my family bustled around downstairs preparing for Brooklyn's departure to the airport, I took a long shower and got dressed methodically, choosing my words as carefully as my outfit. This conversation needed to be handled strategically. I found them in the breakfast nook where Eleanor was fussing over Brooklyn's travel snacks, while Richard reviewed flight details on his tablet. Brooklyn looked radiant in an expensive athleisure set, her skin already glowing with anticipation for her tropical healing journey. "Good morning," I said, pouring myself coffee from the French press Eleanor kept on the marble counter. "Morning, honey," Richard replied without looking up from his screen. "Brooklyn's flight leaves at 2, so we'll need to head out around 11 to account for traffic." I sat down across from Brooklyn and wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic mug, using the heat to steady my nerves. "Before you leave, I'd like to understand something about the ring situation." Eleanor's movements at the counter became more deliberate, but she didn't turn around. What do you want to know?" Brooklyn asked, spreading organic almond butter on gluten-free toast with the care of someone who'd never had to worry about grocery budgets. "Well, Marcus didn't just buy that ring from a regular jewelry store. He designed it himself during his last month of life when he was still able to work in his studio. He incorporated diamonds from his grandmother's 1945 wedding set stones that had been in his family for almost 80 years. The center diamond was one he'd been saving for years, waiting for the right person to give it to." Brooklyn's chewing slowed slightly, but she maintained her bright smile. "That's really sweet. He obviously loved you a lot." "He did. And when he died so suddenly, that ring became the only physical reminder I had of his creative vision for our future together. It wasn't just jewelry to me. It was like having a piece of his soul that I could hold on to." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of Eleanor's antique wall clock. Richard finally looked up from his tablet, his expression shifting from distracted to cautious. "Susie," Eleanor said carefully, turning around with a dish towel in her hands, "we understand that the ring had sentimental value, but keeping it wasn't helping you move forward with your life. You've been stuck in grief for months, and we thought this might be an opportunity for everyone to heal together." The casual dismissal of my grief as something inconvenient hit me like a physical blow. "Move forward. Marcus died 6 months ago. Our wedding was supposed to be next month. I think being stuck in grief is pretty normal under the circumstances." "Of course it is," Richard interjected, using the same tone he probably used to calm upset clients. "No one's saying your feelings aren't valid. But we made an executive decision for the family's well-being. Brooklyn needed help, and that ring was just sitting there serving no practical purpose." I set my coffee mug down carefully, fighting to keep my voice level. "So you decided to sell my property without asking me to fund Brooklyn's vacation?" "It's not a vacation," Brooklyn said, her tone becoming defensive for the first time. "This is serious healing work. I'm dealing with real trauma from my marriage to Kyle. The therapists at this retreat center specialize in helping women recover from emotional abuse and manipulation." "What kind of emotional abuse?" I asked, genuinely curious, since I'd never heard details about her marriage problems, beyond vague references to Kyle being controlling. Brooklyn's eyes filled with tears that seemed to appear instantly on command. He monitored my spending, questioned my friendships, made me feel guilty for wanting nice things. I lost myself completely in that relationship, and now I need professional help to find my way back to who I really am. I nodded sympathetically while mentally noting that monitoring, spending, and questioning friendships sounded like pretty standard responses to Brooklyn's historically irresponsible financial habits. and poor choice in friends. "I'm sorry you went through that," I said, "but I still don't understand why my ring had to be sold to pay for your recovery. Mom and Dad have plenty of money for a 3-month retreat." Eleanor's face flushed pink. "Actually, sweetheart, we don't. Your father's business has had some cash flow issues this year, and we've been supporting Brooklyn since her divorce left her with nothing. We couldn't afford to pay for the retreat outright without making some financial adjustments." This was news to me. Richard's accounting firm had been successful for over 20 years, and they lived like people with significant assets. Their house alone was worth over $2 million. "What kind of cash flow issues?" I pressed. Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Nothing serious, just some clients who've been slow to pay their bills, and we had to invest in new software systems. It's temporary." "But the ring sale solved your cash flow problems." "It helped," Eleanor admitted, "and we thought you'd understand that family comes first. Brooklyn needed help, and you didn't need that ring sitting in a jewelry box making you sad." The casual certainty in her voice that they knew what I needed better than I did was infuriating, but what came next was even worse. Brooklyn reached across the table and patted my hand like she was comforting a child. "Honestly, Susie, you should be grateful they're helping you let go of painful memories. Holding on to Marcus's things isn't healthy. This retreat is going to teach me so much about releasing attachments that I can share with you when I get back." I stared at her perfectly manicured hand on mine, processing the fact that she thought I should be grateful for having my most precious possession stolen to fund her self-discovery journey. "How much did the retreat actually cost?" I asked. Brooklyn and Eleanor exchanged a quick glance that confirmed my suspicions. "Well," Brooklyn said slowly, "the basic package was $50,000 for 3 months, but I upgraded to the premium experience because it includes private coaching sessions and excursions to sacred temples. The total came to about $200,000 with flights and shopping for appropriate retreat wear." $200,000. They had sold my $590,000 ring and given Brooklyn $200,000 for a luxury vacation disguised as therapy. "So there's still almost $400,000 left from the sale?" I asked. Richard nodded. "We'll work out a fair distribution once Brooklyn returns and we see how much additional support she needs for her reintegration period." Translation, they would give Brooklyn whatever she wanted, and I would get whatever was left over, if anything. "Actually," Brooklyn added brightly, "Kyle might contest some of our divorce settlements, so I should probably keep most of the money available for legal fees, just in case." And there it was. They had no intention of giving me any significant portion of my own money back. Brooklyn would find ways to spend or claim all of it, and my parents would support her completely. I nodded slowly, as if this all made perfect sense. "I think I understand the situation now." The relief on their faces was almost comical. They had been bracing for tears, accusations, maybe a dramatic confrontation. Instead, I was being reasonable and mature about their theft. "I'm so glad," Eleanor said, her whole body relaxing. "I was worried you might not see the bigger picture." "Oh, I see it very clearly now," I assured her. "And Brooklyn, I really hope Bali gives you everything you're looking for." Brooklyn beamed, apparently interpreting my words as sisterly support for her journey, rather than the farewell they actually were. "Thank you. I'm going to send you so many pictures and updates. This is going to be life-changing for our whole family." I smiled and nodded, letting them believe they had successfully manipulated me into accepting their betrayal. Because while they thought they had gotten away with stealing from me to fund Brooklyn's indulgences, I was already planning my response. And unlike their impulsive decision to sell my ring, my response was going to be very carefully calculated. Later that afternoon, after we'd returned from dropping Brooklyn off at the airport, the house felt strangely quiet. Without her constant chatter about meditation schedules and organic meal plans, the reality of what had happened seemed to settle over my parents like a heavy blanket. I was sitting in the living room flipping through an old magazine when Eleanor appeared in the doorway with red-rimmed eyes. Honey, can we talk? I looked up with concern as if I hadn't been expecting this moment. Of course! Are you okay? She sat down beside me on the cream-colored sofa, twisting her wedding ring nervously. Richard appeared from his home office, hovering in the doorway like he wasn't sure whether to join us or retreat. I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. Eleanor began, her voice shaky. And I realize we may have handled things poorly. What do you mean? I asked, keeping my expression neutral. Richard stepped into the room and sat down in his leather armchair, the one he'd claimed as his spot for as long as I could remember. Your mother's right. We should have discussed the ring situation with you before making any decisions. Eleanor reached for my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. I keep thinking about how you described Marcus designing it for you, using his grandmother's stones. We didn't realize how much the personal history meant to you. Tears began spilling down her cheeks, and I felt a familiar tug of sympathy despite everything that had happened. This was how our family dynamics had always worked. Eleanor would make impulsive decisions based on emotion, realize later that she'd caused problems, then cry until everyone forgave her and moved on. We thought we were helping, she continued. Brooklyn seemed so lost and desperate, and you seemed so sad whenever you looked at that ring. We honestly believed we were solving two problems at once. Richard leaned forward in his chair, adopting the earnest expression he used when trying to close difficult deals with clients. The truth is, we panicked. Brooklyn was talking about some very dark thoughts, and when she mentioned this retreat center, we felt like we had to act quickly to save her. This was new information. Brooklyn hadn't mentioned any dark thoughts to me, just vague complaints about Kyle and her need for spiritual renewal. What kind of dark thoughts? I asked. Eleanor's crying intensified. She said she didn't see the point in going on, that she felt completely broken and worthless. She was talking about maybe not being around to burden anyone anymore. My stomach dropped. If Brooklyn had genuinely been expressing suicidal thoughts, that would put their decision in a completely different context. Oh, when did she say this? About a month ago, Richard replied. Right around the time she found that retreat center online. She said it felt like a sign, like the universe was giving her one last chance to find herself again. I processed this carefully. Either Brooklyn had been manipulating them with threats of self-harm to get what she wanted, or she had been genuinely struggling and I'd been too absorbed in my own grief to notice. Why didn't anyone tell me she was having those kinds of thoughts? Eleanor wiped her eyes with a tissue Richard handed her. She made us promise not to tell you. She said she didn't want to burden you when you were dealing with your own pain from losing Marcus. So when the retreat opportunity came up, we felt like we had to move fast, Richard added. The enrollment deadline was approaching, and we didn't have time for a family meeting about finances. We should have found another way to pay for it, Eleanor said, gripping my hand tighter. We should have taken out a loan or sold something of our own. Taking your ring without asking was wrong, and I'm so sorry. The apology felt genuine, and their explanation about Brooklyn's mental state made their panic response more understandable, but it didn't change the fact that they had stolen from me, or that they had dismissed my grief as something I needed to get over. I appreciate you apologizing, I said carefully, but the ring is already sold and Brooklyn is already in Bali. So what happens now? Richard straightened up, clearly relieved to be moving into problem-solving mode. We make things right. We'll have the ring sale proceeds transferred directly to your account, minus what Brooklyn actually needed for the retreat. You can use that money however you want, maybe even commission someone to recreate Marcus's design if you have detailed photos. Or, Eleanor added hopefully, you could use some of the money to take your own healing trip somewhere? Maybe somewhere that holds good memories of you and Marcus. The offer was generous, and part of me wanted to believe they were genuinely trying to fix their mistake. But I had already discovered too much about their financial situation and decision-making process to trust their promises. That sounds fair, I said instead, forcing a smile. How long do you think it will take to sort out the money transfer? Oh, a few weeks at most, Richard replied confidently. The estate dealer transferred the funds to our business account, so I'll need to move things around to make sure Brooklyn's retreat expenses are properly categorized for tax purposes. A few weeks would give me plenty of time to verify their claims and figure out exactly how much money had really been involved in this transaction. I have another idea, too. Eleanor said, her mood brightening now that I seemed to be accepting their apology. What if you flew out to visit Brooklyn in Bali in a few weeks? You could turn it into a sister's trip, and she could share some of what she's learning about healing and moving forward. The suggestion that I should spend my own money to visit the sister who had taken my inheritance to fund her vacation was so tone-deaf that I almost laughed out loud. "That's really thoughtful," I said instead. "Let me think about it." We spent the rest of the evening in what felt like normal family time. Eleanor made her famous pot roast. Richard told stories about his latest clients, and I shared updates about my job at the marketing firm in Boston. To anyone watching, we looked like a loving family that had worked through a difficult misunderstanding. But underneath the surface normalcy, I was cataloging every detail of their explanation and every promise they made. Because while they thought they had successfully managed a family crisis, I was building a case. By the time I drove back to Boston the next morning, I had recorded several hours of conversations on my phone, including their admissions about selling my property without permission and their detailed explanations of their financial motivations. I also had a much clearer picture of how my family really viewed me. They saw me as the stable, understanding daughter who would always be willing to sacrifice for Brooklyn's needs. They expected me to be grateful for their intervention in my grief process and excited about opportunities to support Brooklyn's latest self-improvement phase. What they didn't realize was that I had spent the last 6 months learning to live without the person I loved most in the world. That experience had taught me exactly how much I could survive and exactly how little I actually needed from people who claimed to care about me but consistently put other priorities first. They had made their choice when they sold Marcus's ring. Now I was going to make mine. The drive back to Boston gave me 2 hours to think clearly for the first time since discovering the theft. By the time I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage, I had the beginnings of a plan. My first call was to Jake Morrison, Marcus's best friend and the closest thing to a brother I'd ever had. Jake was a forensic accountant who specialized in tracking financial fraud for corporate investigations. If anyone could help me unravel what had really happened with my ring and my family's finances, it was him. "Susie." Jake's familiar voice carried genuine warmth when he answered his phone. "I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up?" "Not great, actually. I need your help with something, and it's not going to be a fun conversation." Jake's tone immediately shifted to professional concern. "What's going on?" I gave him the entire story from finding the empty jewelry box to my parents' explanations about Brooklyn's suicidal thoughts and their cash flow problems. Jake listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief or anger. "They sold Marcus's ring without asking you," he said when I finished. "Susie, that's theft, plain and simple." "I know, but they think they were helping Brooklyn through a mental health crisis and they've promised to give me most of the money back. I'm wondering if I should just let it go and try to preserve what's left of our relationship." "Absolutely not," Jake said firmly. "Marcus spent weeks on that ring design. He showed me the sketches, talked through every detail of the setting. That ring was his masterpiece, and your parents treated it like scrap metal to be liquidated." Hearing Jake defend Marcus's memory so fiercely brought tears to my eyes. "So what do I do?" "First, we figure out exactly what happened with the money. $590,000 is serious money even for people like your parents. If Brooklyn really only spent $200,000 on her retreat, where did the other $390,000 go?" "Dad said they'd transfer it to my account, minus Brooklyn's expenses." "Don't hold your breath. In my experience, when families start playing fast and loose with financial boundaries, the explanations rarely match the reality. Can you get me documentation of the sale? I'm not sure how. They use their estate dealer, but I don't know which one. That's fine. I can track it down through county records and estate sale databases. What I really need is access to your financial accounts to see if there's been other activity you don't know about. My stomach dropped. What kind of other activity? Susie, think about it. Your parents sold your ring to solve cash flow problems, but your dad runs a successful accounting firm and they live in a house worth millions. Either they're lying about their financial situation or there are bigger problems they haven't told you about. Or both. Or both. Do you have any power of attorney documents or shared account access they might have used to move money around? I thought back to the weeks after Marcus's death when I'd been too devastated to handle basic tasks like paying bills or managing my insurance claims. Mom helped me set up some accounts for Marcus's life insurance payout, and I think I signed some temporary access forms when I was in the hospital for a few days after his funeral. What kind of accounts? Investment accounts, a trust fund, some kind of tax-sheltered savings plan. I wasn't really paying attention. I just wanted someone else to handle the financial stuff so I could focus on grieving. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Susie, how much was Marcus's life insurance payout? $1.2 million. His company had excellent coverage. And how much of that money have you actually seen or used? I realized with growing horror that I had no idea. I'd been living off my regular salary, assuming the insurance money was safely invested for my future. I'd never actually checked the account balances or reviewed any statements. I need to call you back, I said, my hands already shaking as I reached for my laptop. Susie, wait. Before you log into anything, I want you to take screenshots of all your account access pages. If someone's been moving your money around, we need to document the current state before they realize you're checking up on them. For the next hour, Jake walked me through documenting my financial accounts, while I discovered the scope of my family's betrayal. The investment account that should have held $1.2 million contained just over $400,000. The trust fund showed numerous withdrawals over the past 4 months, all authorized with electronic signatures that looked like mine, but that I had never created. Jake, I whispered, staring at a withdrawal record showing $50,000 taken out just 2 weeks ago. They've been stealing from me for months. It looks like it. The good news is that this creates a clear paper trail of financial fraud. The bad news is that your family has been systematically robbing you while you were grieving your fiancé's death. I felt nauseous. How much is missing? Based on what you're showing me, close to $800,000 over 6 months. And that's just from the accounts you know about. If they had temporary power of attorney, they could have opened additional accounts or investments in your name. What do I do? Jake's voice took on a protective edge that reminded me why Marcus had loved him like a brother. You document everything, you hire a lawyer, and you make them pay for what they've done. This isn't family drama, Susie. This is criminal fraud, and they've been counting on your grief and trust to get away with it. But what if Brooklyn really was suicidal? What if they genuinely thought they were saving her? Then they should have used their own money, not stolen yours. Mental health emergencies don't justify committing felonies against family members. I spent the rest of the evening working with Jake to document every suspicious transaction and piece together a timeline of the theft. By midnight, we had a clear picture of systematic financial abuse that had started almost immediately after Marcus's death. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching attorneys who specialize in family financial fraud. By afternoon, I had consultations scheduled with 3 different law firms for the following week. But the most important call I made was to my parents' house. Eleanor answered on the second ring, her voice bright with maternal concern. Sweetheart, I was hoping you'd call. Your father and I have been talking, and we want to speed up getting your money back to you. We feel terrible about how we handled everything. That's so thoughtful, I replied, injecting warmth into my voice. I've been thinking about what you said about visiting Brooklyn in Bali. Maybe a sister's trip would be good for both of us. Eleanor's relief was audible. Oh, honey, that's wonderful. I think Brooklyn would love that. She sent the sweetest text yesterday about how grateful she is for our family's support. I'm grateful too, I lied smoothly, for everything you and Dad have done to help me move forward from Marcus. You're right that holding on to painful reminders wasn't healthy. We chatted for another 10 minutes about Brooklyn's first impressions of Bali and my parents' plans to visit friends in Florida next month. To Eleanor, this was confirmation that their family crisis management had been successful. To me, it was intelligence gathering for the legal case I was about to build against them. Because while they thought they had stolen from me and gotten away with it, they had actually just handed me all the evidence I needed to destroy them. And unlike their impulsive theft of my ring, my response was going to be carefully planned, thoroughly documented, and absolutely devastating. They had underestimated me for the last time. Jake and I met at a downtown Boston coffee shop the following Tuesday morning. He arrived carrying a thick folder and wearing the grim expression I'd learned to associate with his most serious fraud cases. It's worse than we thought, he said without preamble, sliding into the booth across from me. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, bracing myself. How much worse? Your parents have been accessing your accounts using forged power of attorney documents. The signatures match yours perfectly, which means they either practiced copying your handwriting or they have access to a signature stamp or digital signature software. Jake opened his folder and spread out printed bank statements across the small table. They've been methodical about it too. Small withdrawals at first, probably testing to see if you'd notice. When you didn't, they got bolder. I scanned the papers, seeing my name on transactions I'd never authorized. How did they even get access to these accounts in the first place? That's where it gets interesting. Do you remember signing any documents when you were in the hospital after Marcus's funeral? I thought back to those hazy days when everything felt like it was happening underwater. Vaguely, Mom said there were some insurance forms and estate planning documents I needed to sign. Well, according to the bank records, one of those documents was a limited power of attorney that gave your parents temporary access to manage your finances during your incapacitation due to grief. Except the incapacitation clause was written so broadly that they could interpret it however they wanted. Is that legal? Jake's expression darkened. If you were genuinely incapacitated and signed it willingly, yes. But if you were misled about what you were signing, or if they modified the documents after you signed them, then it's fraud. He pulled out another set of papers. But here's the really interesting part. I tracked down the estate dealer who handled your ring sale. Your parents used your name on the sale documents and forged your signature on the authentication papers. My blood ran cold. They pretended to be me. Not exactly. They presented themselves as your representatives with legal authority to sell your property, but the signature on the sale contract doesn't match the signature on the power of attorney documents from your insurance company. Jake pointed to two different signatures at the bottom of different forms. This one looks like your mother's handwriting trying to copy yours. This one looks like your father's attempt. They weren't even consistent about which one of them was forging your signature. I sighed at the evidence of my parents' deception, feeling sick. So they definitely committed fraud. Multiple felonies, actually, identity theft, forgery, embezzlement, and that's just what we can prove from these documents. What about Brooklyn's retreat? Have you been able to verify what she actually spent? Jake's smile was predatory. That's where this gets really interesting. I contacted the retreat center in Bali directly, claiming to be from an insurance company investigating a potential claim. Brooklyn's total package cost $50,000 for 3 months, not the $200,000 she told you. So where did the other $150,000 go? Good question. I also did some digging into Brooklyn's recent financial activity. Jake pulled out another sheet of paper. Your sister has been very busy with her credit cards lately. New BMW purchased 6 weeks ago for $68,000. Cosmetic procedures totaling $32,000 over the past 3 months. Designer shopping sprees at high-end boutiques in Hartford and New York. I felt dizzy. She told us she was financially struggling after her divorce. About that divorce, Jake said, his tone becoming even more serious. I ran a public record search. Brooklyn and Kyle were never legally divorced. The coffee shop seemed to tilt around me. What? They're still married. Have been this whole time. In fact, Kyle owns a consulting firm based in Switzerland, and he's been moving money through various international accounts for the past year. I struggled to process this information, so Brooklyn lied about being divorced. It looks that way, and if Kyle is involved in moving money internationally, while Brooklyn claims to be a struggling single woman, there might be tax fraud involved too. Jake leaned forward, lowering his voice. Susie, I think your family has been running a long-term financial scam, and you've been their primary target. Brooklyn's probably been funneling money to Kyle in Switzerland while your parents help her access your accounts. But why my parents have money of their own? Do they? I pulled some public records on your father's accounting firm. He's been facing some serious problems with the IRS over client audit issues, and there are several pending lawsuits from former clients claiming financial mismanagement. The room spun around me. He said there were some cash flow issues. Cash flow issues is one way to put it. Professional bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for financial malpractice is another way. Jake gathered up the papers and slid them back into his folder. Your father has been embezzling client funds to cover his business expenses, and your mother has been helping Brooklyn steal from you to fund their international money laundering operation. I sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this information with the family dinner just 1 week ago, where my parents had tearfully apologized for their mistakes. What happens now? I finally asked. Now you decide how far you want to take this. We have enough evidence for criminal charges against all three of them, but once we start that process, there's no going back. Your family relationships will be permanently destroyed. I thought about Marcus's ring, sold without my permission to fund a luxury vacation disguised as therapy. I thought about my trust fund systematically drained while I grieved the love of my life. I thought about Brooklyn's fake tears about her traumatic divorce from a husband she was still married to. They destroyed our family relationships when they decided to steal from me, I said quietly. I want them prosecuted for everything they've done. Jake nodded approvingly. Then, we need to move fast. If Brooklyn is planning to stay in Bali permanently with Kyle, we need to freeze their assets before they can move everything offshore. How do we do that? We file for emergency asset preservation orders while we prepare the criminal complaints. It'll take a few days to get everything together, but once we serve the papers, all their accounts will be frozen pending investigation. I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For months, I'd been drifting through life feeling like I'd lost control of everything that mattered. But now, for the first time since Marcus's death, I was taking decisive action to protect myself. Let's do it, I said. Jake smiled grimly. Your parents think they're dealing with a grieving daughter who'll forgive anything for the sake of family harmony. They have no idea they're about to face someone who learned from the best forensic accountant in New England. And what did you teach me? That when people steal from you, you don't just get even. You make sure they can never do it to anyone else ever again. I raised my coffee cup in a mock toast. To justice for Marcus. To justice for Marcus, Jake agreed. And to making sure your family learns that stealing from people who trust you isn't a family value, it's a federal crime. Diana Walsh's law office occupied the entire 32nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Boston's financial district. Her reputation for handling high-stakes family financial fraud cases had earned her a waiting list of clients, but Jake's referral got me an emergency consultation within 24 hours. Diana was exactly what I'd expected from Jake's description, sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed, and ruthlessly focused. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, but mostly studying my face, as if evaluating whether I had the stomach for what was coming. "Your friend Jake has provided excellent preliminary documentation," she said when I finished explaining the situation. "Based on what you've shown me, I believe we have grounds for criminal charges, including identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement." "What kind of consequences are we talking about?" Diana consulted her notes. "Federal charges typically carry sentences of 5 to 20 years, depending on the amount stolen and the sophistication of the scheme. Your parents could face substantial prison time and their professional licenses would be permanently revoked." The reality of destroying my family's lives felt heavier than I'd expected. Is there any way to recover the money without criminal charges? Unlikely. Civil recovery typically takes years and requires the defendants to have assets available for seizure. If your sister is planning to relocate to Switzerland, with her husband, civil court won't be able to touch money they've moved offshore. Diana leaned forward, her expression becoming more intense. "But there's something else you need to know. During my preliminary research into your father's business practices, I discovered he's been under federal investigation for embezzling client funds for over 8 months. My stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means the FBI has been building a case against him independently of your family situation. When we file charges related to your stolen money, it's going to accelerate their existing investigation and probably trigger additional charges." "How much money are we talking about?" Diana consulted another document. Preliminary estimates suggest he's embezzled approximately $2.8 million from client accounts over the past 3 years. Your stolen inheritance was apparently just one piece of a much larger pattern of financial crime. I felt nauseous. "So he's going to prison regardless of what I do?" "Almost certainly. The question is whether you want justice for what he did to you or whether you want to let him face the music only for his business crimes." "What about Brooklyn and my mother?" "Your mother could claim she was manipulated by your father and didn't understand the legal implications of her actions. Brooklyn's international money movements make her case more complicated, especially if she's been evading taxes on income from Kyle's Swiss business." Diana pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal what looked like financial records. "We've been able to trace approximately $600,000 from your accounts to international wire transfers that ended up in Switzerland. If Brooklyn has been helping Kyle evade American tax obligations, she could face federal charges for money laundering." The scope of my family's criminal enterprise was staggering. "How long have they been doing this?" "Based on the records we've obtained, the systematic theft from your accounts started about 2 weeks after Marcus's death. But the international transfers suggest they'd been planning this for much longer." Diana closed the folder and looked at me directly. "I need you to understand something important. Once we file these charges, your family is going to realize how much evidence we have against them. They're going to panic, and they might try to intimidate you into dropping the case." "What kind of intimidation?" "Emotional manipulation claims that you're destroying the family over money threats about your parents' health problems, guilt about Brooklyn's supposed mental health issues. They might even claim that Marcus wouldn't want you to pursue this." The mention of Marcus hit like a physical blow. They wouldn't. They absolutely would. People facing serious criminal charges will say anything to avoid consequences. You need to be prepared for them to attack every emotional vulnerability you have. Diana's assistant knocked and entered with several documents for signature. While Diana reviewed the paperwork, I thought about Marcus's ring being sold like scrap metal to fund Brooklyn's lies and my father's embezzlement schemes. "I want to proceed with full criminal charges," I said when Diana's assistant left. "Are you certain this process is going to be emotionally brutal and there's no guarantee we'll recover all your stolen money?" "I'm certain. They counted on my grief and trust to get away with stealing from me. I want them to face the consequences of that choice." Diana smiled approvingly. "Then we'll file for emergency asset preservation orders tomorrow morning. Within 48 hours, all their bank accounts, credit cards, and investment portfolios will be frozen pending criminal investigation." "What happens to Brooklyn in Bali?" "Her passport will be flagged by federal authorities. If she tries to leave Indonesia, she'll be detained and extradited to face charges here. If she stays in Bali, she'll be stuck there without access to American banking systems." The poetic justice of Brooklyn being trapped in her luxury retreat while facing federal charges felt deeply satisfying. "Well, one more thing," Diana added. "We're going to need you to continue acting normal with your family until we serve the legal papers. If they suspect you're building a case against them, they might try to destroy evidence or move more money offshore." "How long do I have to pretend?" 3 days. We'll serve papers simultaneously to all parties Thursday morning. Until then, if they contact you, you need to respond normally and continue recording any conversations where they discuss the theft. I had been dreading more contact with my family, but the idea of gathering additional evidence of their crimes was appealing. What if they ask about visiting Brooklyn in Bali? Diana's eyes lit up. That would be perfect. Encourage them to talk about Brooklyn's financial situation and her plans for staying in Indonesia. Anything they say about international money transfers or tax avoidance could strengthen our case. I left Diana's office feeling like I'd been handed the tools to build a fortress around myself. For months, I'd felt powerless against my family's emotional manipulation and financial exploitation. But now I had a team of professionals who understood exactly how to fight back against people who used love and trust as weapons. Marcus had always told me that the most important thing in life was protecting the people and principles you cared about. He'd spent his final weeks creating something beautiful for our future together, pouring his love into every detail of my ring's design. My parents in Brooklyn had stolen that love and sold it to fund their crimes. Now it was time to show them what it cost to steal from someone who had already lost everything that mattered. Brooklyn's departure for Bali became a celebration that made me sick to watch. Eleanor spent the entire week leading up to her flight posting social media updates about her brave daughter's healing journey, complete with hashtags about spiritual growth and family support. The Bon Voyage party on Saturday night was Eleanor's masterpiece of manipulative theater. She invited extended family, longtime family friends, and even some of Richard's business associates to toast Brooklyn's courageous decision to prioritize her mental health. I arrived fashionably late carrying a beautifully wrapped gift and wearing my most supportive sister smile. The house was packed with people who had no idea they were celebrating the successful theft of my inheritance. Susie. Brooklyn rushed over as soon as she saw me resplendent in a flowing white dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "I'm so glad you came, and I love that you're finally supportive of my journey." I hugged her warmly, making sure several family friends witnessed our sisterly affection. "I wouldn't miss it. This is such an important step for you." Uncle Tom, Richard's older brother, appeared beside us with a cocktail in hand. "Your parents are saints for supporting Brooklyn through this difficult time. Not many families would make such a financial sacrifice for mental health treatment." "It's really incredible," I agreed. "I think the retreat is going to be life-changing for all of us." Brooklyn beamed, apparently interpreting my words as enthusiasm for her spiritual awakening rather than anticipation for her arrest warrant. I spent the evening circulating through the party, listening to guests praise my parents' generosity and Brooklyn's courage. Eleanor had crafted a narrative where she and Richard were selfless parents who had liquidated assets to save their troubled daughter from suicidal depression. We sold some family jewelry that was just sitting around collecting dust. I heard Eleanor tell Richard's business partner, David. It seemed silly to keep expensive things locked away when Brooklyn needed help healing from her traumatic divorce. Family jewelry, as if Marcus's custom engagement ring was some inherited trinket, rather than a priceless work of art created specifically for me. Richard held court near the bar, accepting congratulations for his parenting wisdom. Sometimes you have to make tough financial decisions for the good of the family, he said to a group of neighbors. Brooklyn's mental health was more important than any material possession. I made sure to position myself close enough to record several of these conversations, capturing their casual admissions about selling my property without permission. The most surreal moment came when Aunt Martha, Eleanor's sister, pulled me aside for a heart-to-heart conversation. "I'm so proud of how mature you're being about this whole situation," she said, squeezing my arm affectionately. "I know that ring meant a lot to you, but supporting Brooklyn's recovery shows real family loyalty." "Marcus would have wanted his ring to help someone heal," I replied, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. He always believed in putting family first. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "You're going to be such a wonderful aunt when Brooklyn comes back centered and ready to build a new life. A wonderful aunt to the children of a woman who was still married to her Swiss husband and had been lying about her divorce for months while stealing my inheritance." The irony was overwhelming. The highlight of the evening was Brooklyn's tearful speech, thanking everyone for their support and love. She stood on the living room's Persian rug, surrounded by people who believed she was a brave survivor, rather than a sophisticated criminal. "I can't express how grateful I am for this opportunity to heal and grow," she said, her voice breaking with perfectly timed emotion. "When Kyle's emotional abuse left me feeling worthless and broken, I didn't think I'd ever find myself again. But this family's love and support has given me hope for the future." The applause was thunderous. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Richard stood proudly beside his accomplished daughter who had overcome so much adversity. "With the special thanks to Mom and Dad for making this possible," Brooklyn continued, "I know it wasn't easy to liquidate family assets for my healing journey, but their sacrifice means everything to me." More applause. I clapped along enthusiastically while recording every word on my phone. Brooklyn's final surprise was announcing that she planned to document her entire retreat experience through blog posts and social media updates. I want to share this journey with everyone who supported me and maybe inspire other women who are struggling to leave toxic relationships. The irony of Brooklyn inspiring women to leave toxic relationships while being married to her supposed abuser was almost too perfect. As the party wound down, I helped Eleanor clean up while she gushed about how well the evening had gone. "Everyone was so supportive," she said, collecting champagne glasses from the coffee table. "I think Brooklyn really felt the love from our community tonight." "She definitely did. And it's wonderful that you documented everything with photos. These memories will be precious when she comes back transformed." Eleanor paused in her cleaning, looking at me with maternal warmth. "I'm so relieved that you've come around on this whole situation. For a while, I was worried you might resent us for selling the ring. I understand now that you were protecting Brooklyn when she needed it most," I said. "Family has to come first, especially during mental health crises." "Exactly. And when she comes back in 3 months healthy and centered, we'll all be grateful that we acted quickly to save her." 3 months. Eleanor had no idea that Brooklyn would be lucky to make it 3 days once the federal asset freezes went into effect and her passport got flagged. I drove home that night with hours of recorded evidence and a clear picture of how my family planned to spin their crimes as acts of love and sacrifice. They had built an entire mythology around Brooklyn's victimhood and their parental heroism. But in less than 5 days, that mythology was going to collide with federal prosecutors who had a very different interpretation of family financial management. Diana had been right about one thing. My family's capacity for emotional manipulation was impressive. They had convinced an entire room full of intelligent adults that stealing from me was an act of generous parenting. Unfortunately for them, they were about to discover that federal judges were much harder to manipulate than family friends. And Brooklyn was about to learn that luxury retreats in tropical paradises could become very expensive prisons when you couldn't access your stolen money or leave the country. The call came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning while I was getting dressed for work. Jake's voice carried barely contained excitement. "It's done. Diana filed the asset preservation orders an hour ago, and federal agents are executing the freezes as we speak." I sat down heavily on my bed, suddenly feeling the weight of what we just set in motion. All of them. Your parents' personal accounts, your father's business accounts, Brooklyn's credit cards, even the joint accounts she shares with Kyle in Switzerland. Everything is frozen pending investigation. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Richard's name appeared on the screen. "That's probably them realizing their credit cards aren't working," Jake said. "Don't answer yet. Let them panic for a while first." Over the next hour, my phone rang constantly. Richard called 6 times, Eleanor called 4 times, and I received increasingly frantic text messages from both of them. "Banking error with all accounts, please call immediately," from Richard at 8:15. "Something wrong with credit cards, can't access any money, call ASAP," from Eleanor at 8:30. "This is urgent family emergency call now," from Richard at 8:45. I let them stew until 9:30, then called back with carefully manufactured concern. "Dad, I just saw your messages. What's happening?" Susie, thank God. We're having some kind of banking crisis. All our accounts have been frozen and our credit cards aren't working. Eleanor can't even buy groceries." Richard's voice carried the bewildered panic of someone who had never experienced financial consequences for his actions. "That's terrible. Have you called the bank?" "I've called everyone. The banks say there are federal holds on all our accounts pending some kind of investigation. They won't tell me anything else." I injected appropriate shock into my voice. "Federal holds? What kind of investigation?" "I have no idea. This has to be some kind of mistake or identity theft situation. Maybe someone's been using our account information fraudulently." The irony of Richard worrying about identity theft while having recently forged my signature on legal documents was exquisite. "What can I do to help?" I asked. "Can you lend us some money for immediate expenses just until we figure out what's going on? Eleanor has prescription medications she needs to pick up, and we can't even pay for gas to drive to the bank." "Of course. How much do you need?" "Maybe $5,000 to cover us for a few days while we sort this out." $5,000 to the people who had stolen over $800,000 from me. The shamelessness was breathtaking. "I can transfer it this afternoon, but Dad, are you sure there's nothing you can think of that might have triggered a federal investigation?" Long pause. "Well, there have been some issues with the business. A few clients have been unhappy with their tax preparations, and there might be some audit questions, but nothing that would justify freezing personal accounts." Richard was still lying even while begging me for help. He knew exactly why federal authorities were investigating him, but he was hoping to maintain his victim narrative. "That sounds really stressful. What about Brooklyn? Have you been able to reach her?" "That's another problem. Her phone isn't working, and we can't send her money for emergencies. We're worried she's stuck in Bali without resources." Actually, Brooklyn was stuck in Bali because her passport had been flagged by federal authorities, and her access to American banking systems had been revoked. But I didn't think Richard needed that information yet. "I'm sure she'll be fine. The retreat center probably provides everything she needs." "I hope so. Susie, I need to ask you something delicate. Have you had any problems with your bank accounts recently?" My heart rate spiked, but I kept my voice steady. "No, why?" "Well, if this is some kind of systematic attack on our family's finances, your accounts might be at risk too. You should check to make sure everything's normal." Richard was fishing to see if I discovered their theft yet. He was probably hoping my accounts had been frozen too, which would support his narrative about being innocent victims of some external attack. I'll check when I get home from work, I promised. But Dad, I have to ask, when you said there were issues with client accounts at the business, how serious are we talking? Another long pause. It's complicated. Some clients are claiming there were errors in their tax filings and there might be questions about how their payments were handled. But I've been an accountant for 25 years. I know how to manage client funds properly. Of course you do, but if federal investigators are involved, it must be pretty serious. I'm hoping it's just a misunderstanding that can be cleared up quickly. The important thing is making sure our family gets through this crisis together. Our family, as if we were all innocent victims facing external threats rather than consequences for crimes Richard had committed. We talked for another 10 minutes, with Richard growing increasingly desperate for reassurance and financial assistance. He asked 3 more times about loaning them money, each request more plaintive than the last. After hanging up, I called Jake immediately. They're panicking exactly like Diana predicted, I reported. Richard's claiming ignorance about everything and begging for loans. Have they figured out that you're behind the investigation? Not yet. He thinks it might be related to his business problems, but he's still hoping to convince me that they're innocent victims. That won't last long. Once they get served with the actual criminal complaints, they'll realize how much evidence we have against them. I felt a flutter of anxiety. When does that happen? Tomorrow morning. Federal agents will serve papers to your parents at their house and to Brooklyn through the American consulate in Indonesia. What should I expect after that? Jake's voice became serious. Expect them to call you crying, screaming, and begging. They'll claim you're destroying the family over money, that Marcus wouldn't want this, that Brooklyn might hurt herself if she's arrested abroad. They'll try every emotional manipulation technique they can think of. Will any of it work? That depends on you. But remember, they made their choice when they decided to steal from you while you were grieving. What happens to them now is the consequence of their actions, not yours. I spent the rest of the day at work trying to focus on marketing campaigns and client presentations while my phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from my family. By evening, Richard had called 12 times and Eleanor had sent 23 text messages ranging from practical requests for money to emotional pleas for help understanding what was happening to them. I didn't answer any of them, because tomorrow they would learn that their eldest daughter wasn't the forgiving victim they'd been counting on. Tomorrow they would discover that stealing from someone who'd lost everything had consequences they never imagined. And tomorrow Brooklyn would wake up in her luxury retreat to find that her passport had been flagged and her American criminal defense attorney was very expensive. Friday morning brought a symphony of panicked phone calls that started before my alarm went off. Richard called at 6:47 a.m., his voice shaking with barely controlled terror. Susie, federal agents, just left our house. They served us with criminal complaints for fraud and embezzlement. They're saying we stole money from you, but that's impossible. We're family. I feigned grogginess, as if his cold had woken me up. What slowdown, Dad? What federal agents? FBI, federal prosecutors, I don't know. They had badges and legal documents, and they said we're being charged with stealing your inheritance money. This has to be some kind of mistake. Richard's voice cracked on the last word, and I could hear Eleanor sobbing in the background. I don't understand. Why would anyone think you stole from me? That's what I want to know, Susie. You have to help us figure this out. These people are claiming we forged your signature and took money from your accounts without permission. You know that's not true, right? The desperation in his voice was almost pitiable. He was still hoping I didn't know about their crimes, still believing he could manipulate me into supporting his innocence. Dad, I'm really confused. Let me call you back after I've had coffee and can think clearly. No, wait, Susie, there's something else. They're saying you're the one who filed these charges against us, but that can't be right, can it? You wouldn't destroy your own family over a misunderstanding about money management. There it was. He'd figured out that I was behind the investigation, but he was still framing it as a misunderstanding rather than acknowledging their theft. I need to go, Dad. Let me process this and call you back. Susie, please. Your mother is having a panic attack. She can't understand how this happened. We need you to help us fix this. I hung up and immediately called Diana. They've been served, I reported. Richard is claiming it's all a misunderstanding and begging me to help them fix it. Predictable. How do you feel? Honestly, a little sick. He sounded genuinely terrified. Diana's voice became gentle but firm. That's normal. But remember, they weren't terrified when they were stealing from you. They were calculating and systematic about their theft. The terror only started when they faced consequences. My phone rang again, Eleanor this time. Oh, Susie, honey, please come home right now. There's been a terrible mistake, and we need your help to fix it. Eleanor's voice was thick with tears and completely unlike her usual composed maternal tone. Mom, Dad told me about the federal agents. What's going on? I don't know. They're saying we stole from you, but that's crazy. We're your parents. Everything we did was to help Brooklyn through her mental health crisis. You understood that. You forgave us. Mom, you're not making sense. Take a deep breath and explain what the agents told you. They said we forged your signature on legal documents. They said we took money from your accounts without permission. They said we committed identity theft. Susie identity theft is what strangers do to steal credit card numbers. We're your family. Eleanor's complete inability to understand that family relationships don't exempt people from criminal law was almost fascinating. What did they say about Brooklyn? That's the worst part. They said she's been detained by Indonesian authorities and can't leave the country until this gets resolved. My baby is trapped in a foreign country because of some bureaucratic mistake. Not a bureaucratic mistake. Federal prosecutors had requested that Brooklyn be held as a flight risk pending extradition hearings. But I didn't think Eleanor needed those details right now. Has anyone been able to reach Brooklyn? She called this morning crying and confused. The consulate officials told her she's wanted for money laundering charges in America. Money laundering? My daughter does yoga and sells boutique clothing. She doesn't even understand what money laundering means. Actually, Brooklyn understood money laundering quite well considering she'd been helping Kyle move stolen American money through Swiss bank accounts. But again, details Eleanor didn't need. What did the agents say you should do next? They gave us a lawyer's business card and said we need to appear in federal court next Tuesday. Susie, we don't have money for a federal criminal defense attorney. Our accounts are frozen and we can't even pay for groceries. What about the money from my ring sale? Long pause. That's all tied up in the investigation too. They froze everything. Translation they had spent, or hidden most of it, and what remained was now evidence in a federal crime. Mom, I want to help, but I need to understand what really happened first. Nothing happened. We helped Brooklyn pay for mental health treatment using money that was just sitting in investment accounts. We had your power of attorney, so it was completely legal. What power of attorney? The one you signed when you were in the hospital after Marcus died. You gave us temporary authority to manage your finances while you were grieving. And you think that gave you permission to sell my engagement ring and take hundreds of thousands of dollars from my accounts. Another long pause. We thought you'd understand once Brooklyn came back healthy. We were going to give you most of the money back. Most of it. Well, Brooklyn needed help getting back on her feet and your father's business had some cash flow issues, but we were planning to work out something fair for everyone. Eleanor was still lying even while begging for my help. She knew they'd spent my inheritance on Brooklyn's lifestyle and Richard's embezzlement cover-up, but she was pretending they'd been planning to return it all along. Mom, I need some time to think about this. There isn't time. We have to hire attorneys and figure out how to get Brooklyn home safely. Susie, you're the only one who can fix this. You can tell the prosecutors it was all a family misunderstanding and ask them to drop the charges. I don't think it works that way. It has to, you're the supposed victim. If you say there was no crime, then there was no crime. Please, sweetheart. You can't let your parents go to prison over trying to help Brooklyn through her mental health crisis. There was the emotional manipulation Diana had warned me about. Eleanor was framing their theft as mental health advocacy and my pursuit of justice as family destruction. Let me think about it, I said again. How long do you need to think? Because every hour that passes makes this worse for all of us. I'll call you back tonight. Tonight, Susie, this is an emergency. Your sister is trapped in Indonesia and your parents are facing federal charges. This isn't something you can sleep on. I hung up and turned off my phone. For the next several hours, I sat in my apartment thinking about Marcus and the life we'd planned together. I thought about his grandmother's diamonds, carefully selected and incorporated into a ring that represented our future. I thought about his final weeks when he'd worked on that design while battling headaches that turned out to be symptoms of the aneurysm that would kill him. And I thought about my family who had seen that sacred object as nothing more than a convenient asset to liquidate for their criminal enterprise. When I finally turned my phone back on, there were 37 missed calls and 42 text messages. Please call us back. This is urgent. Susie, we need you to help us before this gets worse. Your mother is in the emergency room having chest pains. Brooklyn called crying she's scared and alone. How can you do this to your own family? Marcus wouldn't want this. There it was. They'd finally played the Marcus card, claiming knowledge of what my dead fiancé would have wanted in order to manipulate me into helping them escape consequences for their crimes. I deleted all the messages without reading the rest and called Diana. How are you holding up? She asked. They're claiming Marcus wouldn't want me to pursue this. Diana was quiet for a moment. What do you think Marcus would want? I think he'd want justice for people who stole his final gift to me and sold it to fund their lies and crimes. Then I think you have your answer. I did have my answer. My family had made their choice when they decided my grief made me an easy target for financial exploitation. Now they were going to live with the consequences of that choice. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when my family arrived for their arraignment on Tuesday morning. Somehow, the media had picked up the story of a wealthy Connecticut family charged with defrauding their grieving daughter, and it had all the elements of a compelling news narrative. I watched from across the street as Richard and Eleanor climbed the granite steps, flanked by an expensive criminal defense attorney they'd somehow managed to hire despite their frozen assets. Eleanor looked frail and bewildered, while Richard maintained his businessman's composure even with federal marshals escorting them. The formal charges were read aloud in a packed courtroom: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, mail fraud, and embezzlement. The prosecutor's opening statement laid out the evidence, methodically describing how my parents had systematically stolen from my accounts while I grieved my fiancé's death. The defendants exploited their daughter's trust and emotional vulnerability. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen told the judge. They forged her signature on legal documents, liquidated her assets without permission, and used the proceeds to fund their own criminal enterprises and lifestyle expenses. Richard's attorney tried to frame the charges as a family misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion by overzealous prosecutors. My clients believed they had legal authority to manage their daughter's finances during her period of grief-related incapacity, he argued. Any mistakes were made in good faith while trying to help their family through multiple crises. The judge was unimpressed. Mr. Harrison, the evidence suggests a pattern of systematic theft spanning several months, including forged signatures and international money transfers. This goes far beyond family financial management. When Eleanor was asked how she pleaded to the charges, her voice was barely audible. Not guilty, Your Honor. Richard's plea was stronger, but I could see his hands shaking as he spoke. Not guilty. The bail hearing revealed additional details that shocked even me. The prosecution argued that Richard had been embezzling client funds for over 2 years, using increasingly sophisticated methods to hide his thefts. The total amount stolen from his accounting clients exceeded $3 million. The defendant faces additional charges related to his business practices. Prosecutor Chen explained, this case involves not just theft from his daughter, but a pattern of financial fraud affecting dozens of victims. Eleanor's bail was set at $500,000, which she couldn't make with frozen assets. Richard's bail was set at $1.2 million, reflecting the scope of his business crimes. They were both remanded to federal custody pending trial. I sat in the back of the courtroom wearing dark glasses and trying to process the reality of watching my parents being led away in handcuffs. Part of me felt vindicated, but a larger part felt hollowed out by the destruction of whatever family relationships I'd once cherished. The media attention intensified over the following weeks. The story had everything reporters loved: wealthy family secrets, financial betrayal, a grieving daughter seeking justice. Several local news stations ran features, calling it the stolen ring case, and social media picked up the hashtag Justice for Susie. I received hundreds of messages from strangers expressing support for my decision to prosecute my family. Many shared their own stories of financial abuse by relatives who'd exploited their trust during vulnerable periods. But the most meaningful support came from Marcus's family, who had been quietly helping fund my legal expenses while offering emotional support throughout the process. "Marcus would be so proud of your courage," his mother told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "He always said you had an inner strength that most people never had to discover." Marcus's father had been even more direct. "Those people aren't your family anymore. Family protects each other's treasures. They don't sell them for drug money." "It wasn't drug money," I'd corrected gently. "Same difference. They stole from you when you were at your lowest point, and they did it systematically over months. That's not family behavior, that's predator behavior." The investigation had also revealed the full scope of Brooklyn's deception. Federal prosecutors in Switzerland had confirmed that she and Kyle had been moving money through European banks while evading American tax obligations. Kyle's consulting business was actually a sophisticated money laundering operation, serving American clients who wanted to hide assets offshore. Brooklyn's traumatic divorce had been an elaborate fiction designed to justify her need for family financial support, while she and Kyle expanded their international criminal enterprise. The retreat in Bali was supposed to be their base of operations for permanently relocating outside American jurisdiction. Instead, Brooklyn was being held in Indonesian federal detention pending extradition hearings. Kyle had been arrested in Switzerland and was fighting his own legal battles with multiple European authorities. The most surreal development was Brooklyn's social media presence during her detention. She was still posting daily updates about her spiritual journey, but now they included complaints about the negative energy of Indonesian legal proceedings and requests for followers to send money to help with her unexpected legal expenses abroad. Day 42 of my healing retreat read one post: "Learning so much about myself, but dealing with some bureaucratic challenges that are testing my inner peace. If anyone wants to contribute to my legal fund, link in bio. Sending love and light. Bali Healing Legal Challenge, Family Struggles." The comments on her posts were brutal. People who had followed her retreat journey online had figured out that her legal challenges were federal money laundering charges, not bureaucratic misunderstandings. Many expressed outrage at her attempts to crowdfund her defense against charges of stealing from her grieving sister. Richard's accounting firm had collapsed completely. His business partner had filed for bankruptcy after discovering that client funds had been systematically embezzled for years. Several former clients had filed civil suits seeking recovery of their stolen money, and the State Board of Accountancy had permanently revoked Richard's professional license. Eleanor's social circle had evaporated once news of the charges became public. Women who had praised her parenting wisdom at Brooklyn's farewell party now crossed the street to avoid talking to her when she made bail after 3 weeks in federal detention. The family house was in foreclosure proceedings, without access to their frozen accounts and facing hundreds of thousands in legal fees. Eleanor couldn't maintain the mortgage payments. Real estate agents had already started showing the property to potential buyers. Through all of this chaos, my parents continued trying to contact me. They'd found ways around the restraining order by having distant relatives and family friends call on their behalf, always with the same message: I was destroying the family over money, and it wasn't too late to fix things by dropping the charges. Aunt Martha had been particularly persistent. Your parents made mistakes, but they love you, she'd argued during one ambush phone call. Brooklyn is your only sister. Are you really willing to send your whole family to prison over financial disagreements? It's not a financial disagreement, I'd replied. It's identity theft, fraud, and embezzlement. They committed serious crimes against me while I was grieving the love of my life. But they're still your family. No, they're not. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't forge signatures and lie about divorce settlements. Family doesn't sell your most precious possessions to fund criminal enterprises. Aunt Martha had hung up without another word. The preliminary trial was scheduled for early December, which meant spending the holidays knowing my parents would likely be convicted and sentenced to federal prison. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward rather than just surviving. Marcus's ring was gone forever, but his memory had been honored by my refusal to let people profit from exploiting my grief. His family had become my chosen family, offering the love and protection my biological family had failed to provide. And most importantly, I had learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined possible, strong enough to survive losing the love of my life, strong enough to rebuild my identity without him, and strong enough to demand justice when people tried to take advantage of my pain. The old Susie would have forgiven anything to preserve family relationships. The new Susie understood that some betrayals can't be forgiven, and that protecting yourself from people who exploit your love isn't selfish, it's survival. The decision to go public with my story wasn't easy, but it became necessary when my family started their own media campaign, claiming to be victims of a vindictive daughter who had misunderstood their loving intentions. Eleanor's first television interview aired on a local morning show the week before Thanksgiving. She sat beside her attorney wearing a conservative navy suit and speaking in the wounded maternal tone she'd perfected over years of family manipulation. My daughter is in terrible pain from losing her fiancé, she told the sympathetic host. We tried to help her move forward by removing painful reminders and supporting her sister through a mental health crisis. Now we're facing federal charges because grief sometimes makes people lash out at the people who love them most. The interview made my stomach turn. Eleanor was portraying herself as a concerned mother whose good intentions had been criminalized by a grieving daughter's need for someone to blame for her loss. Susie is a wonderful girl, but she's not thinking clearly right now. Eleanor continued dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. We're praying that she'll realize we only wanted to help both our daughters heal from their pain. The host nodded sympathetically. What would you say to people who think parents shouldn't manage their adult children's finances without permission? We had legal power of attorney, Eleanor replied, which was technically true but completely misleading about the scope and purpose of those documents. And everything we did was intended to benefit our family during a crisis period. I watched the interview with Diana in her office, both of us taking notes about Eleanor's statements that contradicted the evidence in our case. She's digging herself deeper, Diana observed. Every interview she gives creates more evidence of their intent to deceive. But what about public opinion? People are starting to think I'm a vindictive daughter who's prosecuting my parents over a family disagreement. That's why we're going to tell your side of the story, but we're going to do it comprehensively with documentation and recordings that prove exactly what they did to you. Diana had arranged for me to work with a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Chen, who specialized in financial crime stories. Sarah had been following the case since the first news reports and was interested in creating a feature-length documentary about family financial abuse. Your story illustrates something that happens to vulnerable people all the time, Sarah explained during our first meeting. Family members exploit trust relationships to commit financial crimes, then claim the victim is being ungrateful or vindictive when they seek justice. We spent 3 weeks creating a comprehensive multimedia presentation of the evidence. Sarah had access to the court records, financial documents, and recorded conversations that proved the systematic nature of my family's theft. But more importantly, she helped me find my voice to tell the story clearly and powerfully. The documentary premiered online on the first anniversary of Marcus's death, exactly 1 year after the brain aneurysm that changed my life forever. Sarah had titled it, "The Ring of Truth, A Daughter's Fight for Justice." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, the documentary had been viewed over 2 million times and shared across every major social media platform. The hashtag #RingOfTruth began trending nationally as people shared their own stories of family financial abuse. Local news stations picked up the story again, but this time with complete context about my family's crimes. The recordings of Eleanor and Richard discussing their theft, the financial documents showing systematic embezzlement, and Brooklyn's social media posts from Bali created an undeniable picture of calculated criminal behavior. "This isn't a family disagreement about money management," I said during my first television interview. "This is about people who exploited my grief to commit federal crimes, then tried to claim their criminal behavior was motivated by love." The interviewer asked about my decision to prosecute family members, a question I'd prepared for extensively. Marcus spent his final weeks creating something beautiful for our future together. That ring represented his love, his creativity, and his family's legacy. When my parents sold it without asking to fund lies and criminal schemes, they didn't just steal my property, they stole my ability to hold on to the most precious reminder of our love. The interview included photos of Marcus and details about the ring's design that helped viewers understand what had really been taken from me. Sarah had also obtained statements from the jewelry designer who had worked with Marcus, describing the weeks of meticulous planning that had gone into creating something unique and meaningful. "Marcus told me he wanted the ring to be something Susie could cherish forever," the designer said in the documentary. "He incorporated his grandmother's diamonds because he wanted their love story to be connected to his family's history. It wasn't just expensive jewelry, it was a family heirloom designed specifically for their future together." The public reaction was swift and decisive. Eleanor's victim narrative collapsed under the weight of documented evidence. Richard's claims about cash flow problems were exposed as lies when federal investigators revealed the extent of his business embezzlement. But the most damaging revelation was Brooklyn's continued deception from Indonesian detention. Federal prosecutors had obtained records proving that she and Kyle had been planning their Bali relocation for over a year, and that the entire story about her traumatic divorce had been fabricated to justify her need for family financial support. Brooklyn's social media posts from Bali were republished alongside bank records showing international wire transfers that coincided with her family's theft from my accounts. The juxtaposition of her luxury retreat photos with evidence of money laundering was devastating to any remaining sympathy for her situation. The most satisfying response came from Marcus's extended family and friends, who had been quietly supporting me throughout the legal process. His grandmother, now in her 90s, gave her first and only media interview about the ring that had incorporated her original wedding diamonds. "Those diamonds represented 60 years of love between my husband and me," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. When Marcus asked to use them in Susie's ring, I was honored that our love would become part of their love. To learn that someone sold those diamonds to pay for lies and crimes breaks my heart. The interview was devastating to Eleanor's claims about removing painful reminders to help me heal. Marcus's grandmother made it clear that the ring had been intended as a bridge between generations, not a burden to be liquidated. Community members who had attended Brooklyn's farewell party began speaking publicly about feeling manipulated and used. Several of Richard's former business associates shared stories about his increasingly erratic behavior and questionable financial practices over the past 2 years. Most importantly, other victims of family financial abuse began reaching out to share their stories. I received thousands of messages from people who had been exploited by relatives during vulnerable periods. After deaths, divorces, medical emergencies, or periods of mental health struggles. Thank you for showing that family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior, wrote one woman whose brother had stolen her inheritance while she recovered from cancer treatment. Your courage to prosecute gives hope to those of us who thought we had to accept family theft as the price of maintaining relationships. The documentary had accomplished exactly what Sarah and I had hoped. It shifted the narrative from family drama to criminal justice, while showing other victims that they didn't have to accept financial abuse just because it came from relatives. By Christmas, my family's reputations were completely destroyed. Their assets remained frozen, and Brooklyn was facing extradition to stand trial alongside her parents. But most importantly, Marcus's memory had been honored by the truth about what had really been taken from me, and why justice mattered more than preserving relationships with people who had betrayed my trust at my most vulnerable moment. The new year brought a cascade of consequences that exceeded even Diana's predictions about how thoroughly my family's lives would be destroyed. January started with Richard losing his final appeal to avoid federal prison, followed by Eleanor's complete nervous breakdown when she realized their house was being sold to pay legal fees. I learned about Eleanor's hospitalization through a concerned call from Uncle Tom, who seemed to expect me to rush to her bedside despite everything that had happened. "Your mother is in the psychiatric ward at Hartford Hospital." He told me, his voice heavy with judgment. "She's been having panic attacks and talking about suicide. The doctors say she can't process the reality of what's happening to her family." "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied, and I genuinely was. Despite everything Eleanor had done, I didn't want her to suffer a complete mental breakdown. "She's asking for you, Susie. The doctors think seeing you might help stabilize her condition." "I don't think that would be helpful for either of us." Uncle Tom's voice became sharp. "She's your mother. She made mistakes, but she's still your mother. Are you really going to let her suffer alone because of money disagreements?" The casual dismissal of criminal fraud as money disagreements was exactly the kind of thinking that had enabled my family's behavior for so long. "Uncle Tom, this isn't about money. It's about systematic theft, identity fraud, and money laundering. Eleanor is suffering the natural consequences of committing federal crimes." "But she's family." "No, she's not. Not anymore." I hung up and called Diana to report Uncle Tom's attempt to manipulate me into visiting Eleanor. "They're going to keep trying," Diana warned. "As the trial approaches and the reality of prison sentences becomes clear, they'll get more desperate to convince you to ask for leniency." "How bad is it looking for them?" "Bad. Richard's business embezzlement case goes to trial next month, and prosecutors are seeking 12 to 15 years based on the amount stolen and the number of victims. Eleanor's case is complicated by her mental health issues, but she's still looking at 5 to 7 years for her role in your theft." "And Brooklyn?" "That's more interesting. Kyle has agreed to testify against her in exchange for reduced charges in Switzerland. Apparently, she was more involved in the international money laundering than even we realized." Diana showed me transcripts of Kyle's interviews with federal prosecutors. According to his testimony, Brooklyn had been the primary architect of their scheme to move American money through European banks while avoiding tax obligations. Her marriage to Kyle was essentially a business partnership designed to exploit international banking laws. She convinced your parents to steal from you specifically because your grief made you an easy target, Diana explained. Kyle's testimony includes recorded conversations where Brooklyn talks about manipulating your emotional state to keep you from checking your financial accounts. The calculated cruelty of Brooklyn's approach was breathtaking. She hadn't just stolen from me, she had specifically targeted my grief as a vulnerability to be exploited. What kind of sentence is she facing? Would 20 to 25 years if she's convicted on all charges. International money laundering carries heavy penalties, especially when it involves systematic fraud spanning multiple countries. By February, the family house had sold at auction for well below market value. Eleanor, newly released from psychiatric hospitalization, was living in a subsidized apartment in a rough neighborhood of Hartford. Richard remained in federal detention, unable to make bail despite repeated attempts by his attorney. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the house sale, complete with photos of the elegant rooms where Brooklyn's farewell party had been held just 6 months earlier. The contrast between the celebration of her healing journey and the reality of her federal detention was stark. Eleanor made one final attempt to contact me directly, showing up at my Boston apartment building in March with a letter she wanted to deliver personally. The security guard called up to my unit to ask if I wanted to see her. "Tell her no," I said, "and tell her if she comes back, I'll file for a restraining order." The guard relayed my message, but called back a few minutes later. "She's asking if you'll at least read the letter. She says it's about your fiancé." Using Marcus's memory to try to manipulate me was the final line I wouldn't let her cross. "Tell her to leave immediately, or I'm calling the police." I never found out what the letter said, and I never wanted to know. Eleanor had forfeited any right to invoke Marcus's memory when she sold his ring to fund her family's crimes. The trials began in April with Richard's business embezzlement case. Federal prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of systematic theft spanning 3 years, affecting 47 different clients who had trusted him with their financial planning and tax preparation. Richard's victims included elderly retirees whose nest eggs he had stolen, small business owners whose tax payments he had diverted to his personal accounts, and middle-class families whose children's college funds had been embezzled to cover his mounting debts. The victim impact statements were devastating. An elderly woman testified that Richard had stolen her late husband's life insurance payout money she'd been saving to pay for her cancer treatments. A young couple described discovering that their son's special needs trust fund had been emptied, leaving them unable to pay for his medical care. Richard Harrison didn't just steal money, the lead prosecutor argued in closing statements. He stole dream security and hope from dozens of families who trusted him with their futures. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Richard showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his attorney later told reporters that he was devastated by the impact his actions had on innocent families. His sentencing was scheduled for June, with prosecutors requesting the maximum penalty of 18 years in federal prison. Eleanor's trial began the following week. Her defense team attempted to portray her as a manipulated wife who had been deceived by Richard about the legality of their actions regarding my accounts. They argued that her mental health breakdown proved she genuinely believed they were helping their family during a crisis period. But the recordings I had made of our conversations undermined that defense completely. Eleanor's own words proved that she understood they were taking my money without permission, and that she viewed my grief as something to be managed rather than respected. "We thought she'd understand that family comes first," Eleanor had said during one recorded conversation. "The ring was just sitting there making her sad." The prosecution played that recording during their opening statement. followed by testimony from Marcus's grandmother about the ring's significance and design history. Eleanor Harrison didn't steal a piece of jewelry, the prosecutor argued. She stole a sacred symbol of love created by a dying man for his future bride, then dismissed her daughter's grief as inconvenient to her financial plans. Eleanor's jury was out longer than Richard's, possibly struggling with the emotional complexity of a mother exploiting her grieving daughter. But they ultimately returned guilty verdicts on all major charges. Her sentencing was scheduled for the same day as Richard's, creating a media spectacle as both parents faced the consequences of their crimes simultaneously. But the most anticipated trial was Brooklyn, scheduled for late summer after her extradition from Indonesia. Federal prosecutors had spent months building a comprehensive case that would likely result in the longest sentence of all. Kyle's cooperation had provided evidence of international criminal conspiracy that went far beyond simple theft from family accounts. Brooklyn had been running a sophisticated operation designed to help wealthy Americans evade taxes and hide assets from federal authorities. My stolen inheritance had been just one stream of money feeding their international laundering network. As spring turned to summer, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected: peace. The legal process had been exhausting and emotionally brutal, but it had also provided closure and validation that my family's behavior had been genuinely criminal rather than merely hurtful. Marcus's family had become my true family, offering the love and support my biological relatives had failed to provide. I had started therapy to process the trauma of being systematically exploited during my period of deepest grief, and I was beginning to rebuild my life around people who genuinely cared about my well-being. Most importantly, I had honored Marcus's memory by refusing to let people profit from exploiting our love. His ring was gone forever, but his legacy lived on in my determination to demand justice and protect others from the kind of betrayal I had experienced. The old Susie would have sacrificed anything to maintain family relationships, even when those relationships were poisonous. The new Susie understood that some bridges need to be burned to protect yourself from people who see your love as weakness to be exploited. The federal courthouse in Hartford was packed for Richard and Eleanor's sentencing hearing on a sweltering June morning. Media trucks lined the street outside, and victim advocates had organized a small rally supporting the dozens of families whose lives had been destroyed by Richard's embezzlement schemes. I sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Diana and Jake, watching my parents face the consequences of their criminal choices. Richard wore an orange jumpsuit, his once proud businessman's posture replaced by the slumped shoulders of someone who had lost everything. Eleanor sat beside her attorney in a simple black dress, her face gaunt from months of stress and medication. Judge Patricia Williams called Richard's case first. The prosecutor read a summary of his crimes that took nearly 20 minutes to complete: 47 victims, $3.4 million stolen over 3 years, systematic forgery and identity theft, obstruction of justice during the investigation. Your Honor, the prosecutor concluded, Richard Harrison wasn't just an accountant who made poor decisions. He was a criminal who used his professional position to exploit the trust of vulnerable families for years. His crimes have destroyed retirements, college funds, and medical savings that victims spent decades building. Richard's attorney made a final plea for leniency, citing his client's previously clean record and claims of mental health issues that had supposedly contributed to his criminal behavior. Mr. Harrison is a man who lost his way during a difficult period, the defense attorney argued. He's prepared to make full restitution to his victims and dedicate the rest of his life to making amends for his mistakes. Judge Williams was unmoved. Mr. Harrison, you systematically stole from people who trusted you with their most precious assets. You funded a lifestyle of luxury and criminal enterprise while your victims struggled to pay medical bills and support their families. She paused, looking directly at Richard with obvious contempt. Your crimes weren't mistakes or lapses in judgment. They were calculated, systematic theft spanning years and affecting dozens of innocent families. I hereby sentence you to 16 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will make full restitution to all victims, and you are permanently barred from any profession involving financial services or client money management. Richard's face crumpled as the sentence was pronounced. 16 years meant he would be in his 70s when released, assuming he survived federal prison. His accounting career, his reputation, his freedom. Everything was gone. Eleanor's sentencing followed immediately. Her case was complicated by mental health evaluations that showed genuine psychological trauma from the investigation and trial process. But Judge Williams was equally unsympathetic to claims that emotional distress excused criminal behavior. Mrs. Harrison, you participated in the systematic theft of your own daughter's inheritance while she grieved her fiancé's death, the judge said. You sold precious family heirlooms without permission, forged legal documents, and helped conceal the proceeds of your husband's embezzlement schemes. Eleanor's attorney had argued for a suspended sentence based on her mental health breakdown and claims that she had been manipulated by Richard. But the recordings of our conversations proved that Eleanor understood exactly what she was doing. Your own words demonstrate that you viewed your daughter's grief as an inconvenience to be managed rather than respected, Judge Williams continued. You showed no remorse for exploiting her vulnerability, only anger that she refused to accept your theft as loving family support. I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You will make full restitution for your portion of the theft from your daughter's accounts. Eleanor collapsed in her chair, sobbing as bailiffs prepared to escort her to federal detention. 8 years meant she would be nearly 70 when released, facing a world where her reputation and social connections had been completely destroyed. The victim impact statements were the most powerful part of the proceeding. Elderly clients testified about losing their life savings. Young parents described having to explain to their children why college wasn't possible anymore. And small business owners shared stories of bankruptcy and foreclosure caused by Richard's theft. But the most meaningful moment for me came when Marcus's grandmother took the stand to speak about the ring that had been sold to fund my family's crimes. That ring represented 4 generations of love. She said, her voice still strong despite her 92 years. My husband gave me those diamonds in 1945 when he returned from the war. When Marcus asked to incorporate them into Susie's ring, I was honored that our love would become part of their future. She looked directly at Eleanor, who was still crying in her chair. You didn't just steal jewelry, Mrs. Harrison. You stole a sacred symbol of love that was meant to connect past, present, and future generations. That theft can never be forgiven or undone. The courthouse emptied slowly after sentencing, with reporters interviewing victims and legal experts about the significance of the harsh sentences. Diana walked me to my car, both of us emotionally drained by the day's proceedings. How do you feel? She asked. Relieved, I said honestly. It's finally over. Not quite. Brooklyn's trial is still coming up in August. Brooklyn's extradition from Indonesia had taken months to arrange, but federal prosecutors had finally succeeded in bringing her back to face charges for international money laundering. Kyle's cooperation had provided evidence of criminal conspiracy that could result in an even longer sentence than her parents had received. Will you testify at her trial? If needed, but I think Kyle's testimony about their international schemes will be more important than anything I can add. Diana nodded. The recordings you made will still be crucial for establishing the family conspiracy aspect. Brooklyn's defense team is going to claim she was manipulated by your parents and Kyle, but your conversations prove she was an active participant in planning the theft. I drove home to Boston, thinking about justice and consequences. Richard and Eleanor would spend their remaining productive years in federal prison, their reputations destroyed, and their assets liquidated to pay restitution to their victims. Brooklyn faced an even worse fate when her trial began in 2 months. Federal prosecutors were seeking 25 years based on the scope of her international money laundering operation and the number of American families who had been defrauded through her network. But the most satisfying consequence was seeing Marcus's memory honored through the legal process. The ring he had designed with such fervent care had been stolen and sold, but the story of its theft had exposed my family's criminal enterprise and led to justice for dozens of other victims. The old Susie would have been devastated by the destruction of her family relationships. The new Susie understood that relationships built on lies and theft weren't worth preserving, and that demanding justice for betrayal was an act of self-respect rather than vindictive revenge. Marcus had taught me to protect the things I loved most. By prosecuting my family for their crimes, I had protected his memory, his legacy, and my own dignity from people who saw love as weakness to be exploited. The ring was gone forever, but the love it represented had been honored by my refusal to let anyone profit from destroying it. That was justice enough. Brooklyn's trial was scheduled to begin on a humid August morning, but 2 weeks before jury selection, she surprised everyone by abandoning her legal defense and pleading guilty to all charges. Her attorney explained that facing 25 years in federal prison had finally convinced her to accept responsibility for her crimes, but I suspected Kyle's detailed testimony about their international conspiracy had made her case impossible to defend. I was in my apartment on a Tuesday evening preparing dinner and trying not to think about the approaching anniversary of Marcus's death, when my building's security buzzer startled me from my thoughts. "Miss Davis, there's a woman down here who says she's your sister. Should I send her up?" My blood froze. Brooklyn was supposed to be in federal detention awaiting sentencing. There was no way she could be at my apartment building. "What's her name?" "She says Brooklyn Harrison. She looks pretty rough, ma'am. Says she just got back from Indonesia and needs to talk to you urgently." I nearly dropped the phone. "Tell her I'm not home. Tell her I'm out of town and won't be back for weeks." "She's crying pretty hard down here. Says it's a family emergency and she'll wait outside until you get back." The last thing I wanted was Brooklyn camping outside my building, potentially creating a scene that would draw unwanted attention. But I also had no intention of letting her into my apartment where she could manipulate me without witnesses. "Tell her to meet me at the Starbucks on Commonwealth Avenue in 1 hour. And tell her if she's not there when I arrive, I'm calling the police." I spent the next hour calling Diana and Jake to report Brooklyn's unexpected appearance. Diana was particularly concerned about Brooklyn being free without notification to the prosecution team. "She was supposed to remain in federal custody until sentencing," Diana said. "Either something went very wrong with the detention system or she's violated her bail conditions by contacting you. Should I even meet with her?" "Yes, but record everything. If she's approaching you illegally, we need documentation of whatever she says." I arrived at Starbucks 10 minutes early and chose a corner table where I could see the entrance clearly. Brooklyn appeared exactly on time, but she looked nothing like the polished woman who had left for Bali almost a year ago. Her honey blonde hair was now dark brown and badly cut, hanging limply around a face that had lost at least 20 pounds. She wore a wrinkled Target t-shirt and jeans that looked like they'd been slept in, and she carried a single backpack that apparently contained all her remaining possessions. "Susie," she said, approaching my table with red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would." I gestured to the chair across from me while starting my phone's recording app. "I'm surprised you're not in federal detention." "They released me on electronic monitoring while I wait for sentencing," she said, sitting down heavily and revealing an ankle bracelet underneath her jeans. I have to stay within 50 miles of Hartford, but I convinced them I needed to make amends with family members before going to prison. What do you want, Brooklyn? She pulled out a tissue and dabbed at her eyes, but the tears looked genuine this time rather than manipulative. I want to apologize for everything we did to you. I want to try to explain how things got so out of control. I'm listening. Brooklyn spent the next 30 minutes telling a story that was probably 50% truth and 50% self-serving fiction. According to her version, Kyle had originally approached her about helping wealthy Americans move money offshore legally, but the operation had gradually become more criminal as they sought higher profits. I never intended for it to involve our family, she claimed, but Kyle kept pushing for access to larger amounts of money, and Mom and Dad were so worried about his business problems that they were willing to do anything to help. So you suggested stealing from me? Not initially. At first, we just wanted to borrow some money from your accounts temporarily and pay it back before you noticed. But Kyle said the international transfers would make more profit if we invested larger amounts. This was clearly a lie. The evidence from Kyle's testimony had shown that Brooklyn had specifically targeted my grief as a vulnerability to be exploited, but I let her continue. When Marcus died and you were so devastated, I thought maybe we could help you by managing your money more actively. I genuinely believed we could make investments that would benefit everyone. By stealing my engagement ring, Brooklyn's composure finally cracked completely. The ring was Kyle's idea. He said keeping it was unhealthy for you and selling it would provide capital for investments that could double or triple your money. And you believed that. I wanted to believe it, she admitted. I wanted to believe we were helping you heal while also solving our financial problems. But mostly, I was scared of Kyle and what he might do if I didn't cooperate with his plans. This was new information and possibly the first completely honest thing Brooklyn had said. What kind of things was Kyle threatening? He said if I didn't help him access American family money, he would divorce me and leave me with nothing. He had evidence of some tax avoidance schemes I'd participated in before we got married, and he threatened to turn me into the IRS if I didn't cooperate. So Brooklyn had been coerced into participating, but she had also been an active criminal participant for years before Kyle started threatening her. Her victimization didn't excuse her willingness to exploit my grief. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm going to prison for 20 years and I need you to know that I'm sorry. I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you and that I understand now how much damage we did to your life and your memories of Marcus. Brooklyn reached into her backpack and pulled out a small jewelry box that made my heart stop. What is that? I managed to track down the estate dealer who bought Marcus's ring. The person who purchased it from them was willing to sell it back when I explained the situation. She opened the box to reveal a ring that looked similar to Marcus's design, but I could tell immediately that it wasn't the same piece. That's not Marcus's ring. No, it's not, Brooklyn admitted. Marcus's ring was broken down for parts, and the stones were sold separately. But this is made with similar diamonds, and I had a jeweler recreate the setting based on photos from your social media. I stared at the replica ring, feeling simultaneously moved by Brooklyn's effort and horrified by her assumption that a reproduction could replace what had been stolen from me. Brooklyn, this isn't Marcus's ring. It's not his grandmother's diamonds. It's not his design. It's not his hands that created it. This is just expensive jewelry that looks like what you stole from me. I know it's not the same, she said, starting to cry again, but I thought maybe it would help you have something to hold on to while you heal from everything we put you through. The only thing that would help me heal is knowing that people who exploit grief face consequences for their actions. Brooklyn nodded miserably. I understand. I'm going to prison for a long time and Mom and Dad are already there. Kyle testified against me to save himself, and now I'm facing everything alone. You're not facing this alone because you're innocent, Brooklyn. You're facing it alone because you chose to be a criminal, and criminals eventually run out of people willing to help them avoid consequences. I stood up to leave, but Brooklyn grabbed my arm desperately. Susie, please. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but we're still family. When I get out of prison in 20 years, I'll have nothing and no one. Can't you at least leave the door open for me to try to make amends someday? I looked at her hand on my arm and remembered all the times she had touched me with false affection while planning to steal from me. Brooklyn, you stopped being my family when you decided to profit from my grief. 20 years from now, you'll still be the person who stole my fiancé's final gift to me and sold it to fund your crimes. I pulled my arm away gently but firmly. I hope you use your time in prison to understand why what you did was unforgivable, but don't expect me to be waiting for you when you get out. Brooklyn's face crumpled as she realized that her final attempt to manipulate family forgiveness had failed. So this is it. You're never going to speak to me again. This is it, I confirmed. You made your choices and I'm making mine. I left her sitting at the table with her replica ring and her tears, knowing it was the last conversation I would ever have with anyone from my biological family. But as I walked back to my apartment, I felt lighter than I had in months. Brooklyn's apology had confirmed what I'd already known they had been calculating. Criminals who had exploited my vulnerability for profit, and my decision to prosecute them had been absolutely correct. The replica ring was a perfect metaphor for what my family had been offering me all along. Something that looked like love and support, but was actually a cheap imitation designed to manipulate my emotions. I had chosen justice over fake reconciliation, and it was the best decision I'd ever made. 3 years later, I stood in Marcus's favorite jewelry studio in downtown Boston, watching a master craftsman put finishing touches on a very different kind of ring. This one wasn't an engagement ring. It was a memorial piece I'd commissioned to honor Marcus's memory and celebrate my own healing journey. The ring incorporated a single diamond from the replica Brooklyn had tried to give me, not because I wanted anything connected to her, but because I'd had the stone recut and blessed by Marcus's grandmother before she passed away peacefully the previous spring. The new setting was entirely my own design, representing the woman I'd become through surviving betrayal and demanding justice. It's finished, the jeweler announced, presenting the ring in a simple wooden box. I think Marcus would be proud of how you honored his memory. I slipped the ring onto my right hand, where it felt both familiar and completely new. This ring represented my choice to move forward without forgetting to heal, without compromising my standards for how people should treat each other. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake, who had become not just my closest friend, but also my business partner in a consulting firm that helped fraud victims navigate legal proceedings. Our company had grown from helping a few families recover from financial crimes to providing services for hundreds of victims across New England. Brooklyn's sentencing was this morning, the text read. 22 years, no possibility of parole before 15. Thought you should know? I felt a moment of sadness for the sister I'd once loved, followed immediately by satisfaction that justice had finally been completed. Brooklyn would spend her 30s and 40s in federal prison learning, too late that exploiting family trust carries severe consequences. Richard had died of a heart attack in federal prison 6 months ago, apparently, unable to survive the stress of incarceration and the knowledge that his crimes had destroyed dozens of innocent families. Eleanor remained in a minimum security facility in West Virginia, where she would likely spend the rest of her productive years paying for her participation in their criminal enterprise. I'd felt no obligation to attend Richard's funeral or maintain contact with Eleanor during her imprisonment. They had chosen to become criminals rather than family, and I had chosen to build my life around people who understood the difference between love and exploitation. The memorial service for Marcus's grandmother had been different entirely. I'd spoken at her funeral about the gifts she'd given me. Not just diamonds for rings, but wisdom about recognizing people who honor your trust versus those who abuse it. Her final weeks had been spent helping me understand that choosing your family based on character rather than biology was an act of self-protection, not selfishness. "Ooh, some people earn the right to be in your life," she told me during one of our last conversations. "Others forfeit that right through their actions. The trick is learning to tell the difference before they can do too much damage." Marcus's parents had legally adopted me the previous year, not because I needed parents, but because we wanted to formalize the family bond we'd built through love and mutual respect. The adoption ceremony had been small but meaningful, witnessed by Jake and Sarah Chen, the documentary filmmaker who had become another chosen family member. Sarah's film about financial fraud in families had won several awards and helped dozens of other victims find the courage to prosecute relatives who had exploited their trust. We'd stayed in touch as she worked on a follow-up documentary about recovery and rebuilding after family betrayal. The most important thing I learned from your story, Sarah had told me during a recent interview, is that forgiveness isn't always the right choice. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is refusing to accept unacceptable behavior, even from family. I'd used part of my recovered inheritance to establish the Marcus Chen Memorial Foundation, which provided legal assistance to victims of family financial fraud and scholarships for students studying jewelry design. Marcus's creative legacy lived on through supporting other artists, while his grandmother's wisdom about protecting precious things guided our work with fraud victims. The foundation's first major success had been helping an elderly woman recover over $200,000 that her son had stolen from her retirement accounts while she recovered from surgery. Our legal team had secured criminal convictions and full restitution, but more importantly, we'd helped her understand that demanding justice from family criminals wasn't vindictive. It was necessary. I spent months thinking I was a bad mother for wanting my own son prosecuted, she'd told me after his sentencing hearing. But your foundation helped me understand that being a good mother sometimes means teaching your children that criminal behavior has consequences. That conversation had crystallized something I'd been learning over 3 years of helping other victims. The people who exploit family relationships for financial gain are counting on their victims' reluctance to destroy family bonds by pursuing justice. They weaponize love guilt and social expectations about family loyalty to avoid consequences for their crimes. But family relationships that require you to accept criminal behavior aren't worth preserving. Real family protects each other's treasures: physical, emotional, and spiritual. Real family would never exploit grief as an opportunity for theft. I'd learned that lesson the hard way when Marcus died, and my biological family decided my vulnerability made me an easy target. But I'd also learned that surviving betrayal by people you trusted most teaches you exactly how strong you really are. The phone rang as I was leaving the jewelry studio. Diana's name appeared on the screen. "I have news about the last piece of your case," she said. "Kyle was convicted in Switzerland and sentenced to 12 years for money laundering. The Swiss government is also seizing all assets connected to his operation and transferring funds to American victims." "How much?" "Another $800,000 in recovery for you, plus compensation for dozens of other families they defrauded. It's not everything, but it's justice." Justice. That word had guided every decision I'd made since discovering my family's betrayal. Not revenge, not punishment for its own sake, but justice. The demand that people face appropriate consequences for their choices, and that victims receive acknowledgement of the harm done to them. I walked home through Boston Common, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment of peace. Losing Marcus had been devastating, but losing my family had been liberating in ways I never could have anticipated. The woman who had grieved alone in her childhood bedroom while discovering theft was gone. In her place was someone stronger, clearer about her boundaries, and surrounded by people who had proven their love through actions rather than just words. Marcus's ring was gone forever, but his memory lived on in my refusal to let anyone profit from destroying what we'd built together. His grandmother's diamonds were scattered to strangers, but her wisdom about protecting precious relationships guided every choice I made about who deserved access to my trust. Most importantly, I'd learned that healing doesn't require forgiving the unforgivable. Sometimes the most powerful act of recovery is refusing to accept that criminal behavior can be excused by family relationships or personal struggles. Brooklyn would spend the next 15 to 20 years in prison, learning that stealing from grieving relatives carries severe consequences. Eleanor would spend her remaining productive years understanding that enabling financial crimes destroys families rather than preserving them. Richard had died knowing that his embezzlement schemes had been exposed and prosecuted, taking with him any chance of avoiding accountability for the families whose lives he'd destroyed. They had all made their choices. Now they were living with the consequences. I had made my choice too. I'd chosen justice over fake family harmony, truth over convenient lies, and self-respect over the social pressure to forgive criminal behavior because it came from relatives. That choice had given me a life surrounded by people who understood that love means protecting each other's deepest treasures, not exploiting them for personal gain. It had given me the strength to help other victims find justice and the wisdom to recognize that authentic relationships built on mutual respect rather than manipulation. As I reached my apartment building, I looked down at the memorial ring on my right hand. It caught the late afternoon sunlight, exactly the way Marcus would have designed it, to creating tiny rainbows that reminded me of his artistic vision and his grandmother's enduring love. The old ring was gone, but the love it represented had been honored through my refusal to let anyone diminish its meaning. Sometimes the greatest act of love is protecting sacred memories from people who would exploit them for profit. That was the lesson I wanted to share with anyone facing similar betrayal family relationships that require you to accept criminal behavior aren't worth preserving. Real love protects what's precious, while false love exploits vulnerability for personal gain. Trust is earned through consistent actions, not demanded through biological relationships or emotional manipulation. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walking away from people who see your deepest pain as an opportunity for profit. I had learned to tell the difference, and that knowledge had set me free. Bigoshad, now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between preserving family relationships and protecting yourself from harmful behavior? What helped you decide what was right for your situation? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar choices. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage, justice, and healing. And please share this with anyone who might benefit from knowing they're not alone in facing family betrayal. Thank you for joining me on this journey toward justice and healing. Remember that you deserve relationships built on genuine love and respect, not exploitation disguised as family loyalty. Until next time, stay strong and trust your instincts about who deserves access to your precious memories and trust.